It is both a privilege and an honor to be with you guys today. What a pleasure it is to worship together at Northern Frontier, right? You guys are all familiar with the story of David and Goliath, right? You've heard that before. Maybe you've seen a VeggieTale episode or two about it, or some other children's version. It's a powerful story, right? Today, my goal is to help you grow in your confidence of God's faithfulness. That makes sense? I'm going to say it again. To grow in your confidence of God's faithfulness. Okay? We're going to see how that plays out in David's life. Let's just dive right in. Right? So this story takes place 3,000 years ago. That's a long time ago. That's almost like Star Wars galaxy, long, far, far away level time ago. Right? Long time ago, 3,000 years ago in the valley of Elah. And you have two armies on opposite mountains, and they're looking at each other, right? The army of the Philistines and the army of the Israelites. And in between them is this flat valley with a dried up riverbed. And stepping forth from the army of the Philistines, as we heard this morning, is this massive man, Goliath of Gath. And he is a mountain, towering almost 10 feet tall, and he's incredibly strong. He defied the power of the living God, or as in the message we hear, God alive. And he called them weak. Goliath shouted out to the army of Israel, making fun of them and heaping shame upon their God, since no one dared to accept his fight to the death and winner take all challenge. For 40 days, Goliath comes forward, but for 40 days the men of Israel fall back. And they step away. It blows my mind. But this murderous machine had sent many men to meet their maker. And anyone who entered one-on-one combat with this guy was signing up for a suicide mission. It's no wonder that the Israelites cowered in fear at the sight of him. The army desperately needed a champion to step up and challenge the giant. But who would face him? Now, sometimes victories are won by the most unexpected people. We call these people the underdogs, right? And don't we love rooting for the underdog? It's just something about them is attractive to us. Something about the guy that's not really sure he's going to win. He's disadvantaged, but he's got passion, and he's got heart, and he's got a purpose. And we tend to favor the unfavorable. You're cheering on an underdog who actually ends up winning. Don't you just feel happier? Like, if you were rooting for the guy that was expected to win, you're like, yeah, all right, we expected that guy to win. But if you root for the guy that's unexpected and he wins, wow, that just feels awesome, doesn't it? You know, there's actually something at the chemical level of our brain that makes us feel this way. See, when something so out of the ordinary comes to happen, there's this chemical, this hormone that releases inside our brains that brings us joy. Our brains are rewarding us for rooting for the underdog. You see what I'm saying? We can't help but root for someone that's less likely to win. But let's stop right there. Because if you see what I'm getting at, don't you think it's possible that maybe we are seeing David as the underdog? But what if he's not? What if David is actually the one favored to win? What if Goliath is the underdog? I'm going to try to help you see that today. See, we usually hear it that way, right? David, the underdog. He's this scrawny young shepherd boy who stands no chance against the giant. He's too young to even join the army, and he had no reason to even be at the battle in the first place. The only reason why he shows up is because his father, Jesse, asks him to go and deliver some bread and cheese to his soldier big brothers. And when he arrived at the battle and he heard the giant and his scornful insults at the God of Israel, David gets furious. He's mad. He stood up for God, and with only one swing of his sling, Goliath is knocked out dead. Often, the story of David and Goliath is described as one of personal courage in the face of overwhelming odds. David, the underdog, an Old Testament superhero. A popular moral to this story might go something like this. Get out there and face your giants, because the heroically courageous always come out on top. Does that sound familiar to anyone? It's typically how we hear it. But I'm going to argue, I'm going to say that is not what the story of David and Goliath is all about. David is no underdog. He certainly didn't talk like an underdog, did he? Remember how he said, I killed lions and bears. That doesn't sound like an underdog to me. And he says, Goliath is just going to be like them, another notch in his belt of defeated foes. But where did David's confidence come from? Why was he so sure in his ability to defeat Goliath? Maybe when you saw me walk up, you saw me take these 5 stones. I laid them here, probably only in the front row can see them now. I'll put them up higher. But today I want to talk about 5 different things that David has or David does. So the first 3 will be, where does David's confidence come from? And the last 2 will be, how did David's confidence impact his life? Okay, so stone number 1. Here we go. Stone number 1. Stone number 1 is David's confidence came from his skill. Okay, so David was, what do we know about him? He's a young shepherd boy. And I don't know about you, but when I think of a shepherd boy, I don't really think, oh, that requires a lot of skill. Right? A shepherd is probably just standing around with his staff, and he's watching grass grow, and he's watching the sheep eat the grass, and then watching that grass grow again. Right? It's kind of boring, doesn't it sound like? But David refused to sit still. You see, he had a sling to occupy his time. At this point, maybe he's like 14 years old. And instead of just sitting around all day, I want you to imagine this. He's in a field with all the sheep, and he's got his, I'll turn this off for you guys. There you go. He's got his sheep, and instead of just standing around, he sees all these stones all over the place, or ammunition. And across the field, he sees stumps and trees, or target dummies. And so instead of sitting and watching, he picks up his sling and he picks up some stones and he practices his accuracy. And with every shot that he hits and sinks into the stump, he gets a little more skilled with the sling. I don't think David had any idea what he was preparing himself for. But that one day, he would sink a stone into the skull of one of God's enemies. Fighting Goliath was David's opportunity to prove his skill. But King Saul doubted his abilities. Remember in the story, David comes up to Saul with great confidence, and Saul says, you are too young and inexperienced. You have no place here. When David confronts Goliath, Saul feels weak. He feels like, I'm supposed to be the king, and here's this 15-year-old shepherd boy who's confident enough to stand for Goliath, and I'm here hiding in my tent. This makes me look weak. So he shrugs off the shepherd boy, and he says, fine, go, and may God be with you. And he tries to outfit him with soldier's armor and giving him a sword to wield, making it seem like David needed to be dressed up in order to actually fight Goliath. But David, he knew his skill that he had with the sling and was confident that he could strike down Goliath. David didn't see himself as an underdog, not at all. When Saul looked out and saw this unstoppable killer, David only saw an obstacle waiting to be moved out of the way. See, sometimes giants are not what they seem to be. The same qualities that give them their strength are actually their sources of great weakness. Goliath's size, strength, weaponry, and armor hardly prepared him for a shepherd boy with a sling. David was no underdog. He had the advantage. God has given each of us talents and skills, and we are responsible to develop those skills. He has a plan for us, and he's building each one of you for things in the future. So I want to ask you guys, what skills do you have? Go ahead. What skills do you have? Yeah?
Piano.
Piano. Awesome. What are more?
How to sign a beat.
You got a side of being good. Yeah. Trumpet? Cool. Another one.
Crafts.
What?
Crafts.
Crafts. Okay. Yeah, over here.
Making up stuff.
Picking up stuff? Okay.
Making up.
Oh, making up stuff. Be creative, sure.
Eating a lot of sugar.
You know, all right, let's get from this side. We're starting to get a little loose over here. What do you got? Being creative. Cool. Got some more?
French horn.
French horn? Yeah.
Praying to God.
Praying to God. Cool. Violin. Got a lot of musicians in the audience. Gonna have a strong band at Northern Frontier one day. Any more? Yeah. Studying. Studying. Cool. Yeah. Basketball. Cool. For sport team. Any more? Yeah. Rock climbing. Cool.
Viola.
Viola. Nice. One more.
Volleyball.
Volleyball. All right. So we've all got different skills and talents. Some of us more than others, and some of us we're just waiting to blossom, right? But each one of us has something that just seems natural. It just seems like we're kind of gifted in that way. And we're responsible for doing those things well, right? If you're a musician, practice your instrument. Learn to play melodies that are just so beautiful. Get good at it. If you're an athlete, play sports. Play them well. Play hard. And if you're creative, if you're an artist, then paint and draw. Express that gift that God has given you, but do it well. And by doing this, you will be honoring God, and who knows, maybe one day those skills could be used to do something amazing. So that's our first stone. David had confidence in his skill. Our second stone is David had confidence in God's faithfulness. See, every once in a while, David's boring day of shepherding got really crazy in the worst way possible. Lions and bears would come to abduct their next meal from the flock, but God supplied David with the strength and the agility to rescue his father's sheep from the clutches of terrible beasts. Now, David is about 14 years old. Can I get someone that's 14? Let's have a couple guys. 14 years old, stand on up. If you're 14 years old, go on, stand up. 14. Any other 14-year-olds? There we go. Got a lot of them. There you go. 14 years old. All right. Now, stay standing if you would willingly go into battle with a lion. Yeah? There we go. He's confident. Cool. Can you imagine any of these guys? No offense, guys. I would not go into battle with a lion. That's crazy. But a lion shows up. And lions are ridiculously strong. Okay? Just for a point of reference, if a lion decided to slap you in the face, it would crush your skull with one hit. No joke. It would literally, a lion's mouth is so strong, your femur is the strongest bone in your body. He could snap it like a toothpick. Okay? That's a lion. Just for reference. Okay? If I was going in to fight a lion and he was trying to steal one of my father's sheep, I'd be like, okay, you got me on this one, lion. You just take that one, okay? See you later. But that's not what David does. David goes and he grabs his staff and he charges the beast and he knocks it on the head. Imagine that. And the lion, wrestling with the sheep, kind of stumbles and doesn't let go, but instead turns and lunges at David, but David doesn't give the lion an inch. He grabs him by the throat with both hands and strangles him to death, killing the lion. What? What? That just blows my mind. There's absolutely no way David, a 14-year-old boy, could have done that on his own strength. All the skill in the world could not make that happen. David trusted in God's faithfulness to give him the might he needed to wrestle a lion. The young shepherd boy had confidence in God to subdue his foes. You could say that David was self-confident or confident in his own strength, right? But more importantly, he was confident in God's strength. Instead of saying David was self-confident, let's say that David was God-confident. Let's get back to Goliath. So a great foe appears before Israel, and the army does not share in David's God confidence, right? When observing David's response to Goliath, the men of Israel felt weak. And as they shrank away, David stepped up. This was the army of Israel, the army of the living God. They knew all the stories about how God had taken down adversary after adversary. removing obstacles and getting them out of their way. And they were stepping away, walking away, falling back from just one man. Many of them had just witnessed God's ability to do amazing things. 25 years before the battle with Goliath, the Philistines had gathered a similar army. This one was 500 times the size of that of the Israelites, who only had 600. They were holding a fort. The Philistines were holding a fort, while King Saul and his men were hiding in caves. But Jonathan, the king's son, decided to take a stand. At this point in the story, Jonathan also 15 years old. Just an interesting point of fact. Jonathan left from hiding and approached the Philistines. Seeing the young prince, they called him over. The Philistines called him over, saying, "We have something to show you." Probably their blades, right? But as Jonathan got closer, the Philistines fell to their knees, uncontrolled. Jonathan went in and he took out 20 of them. And then the earth began to quake and rumble, and the rest of the Philistines, all 30,000 of them, fell and became confused. And when they got up, they started fighting each other. Seeing this, Saul and the Israelites rushed in, and they took the fort, causing the Philistines to flee in fear. Now, imagine yourself as the Philistines. Now we're going 25 years forward, back to the battle with Goliath. What would they have felt like entering battle with the Israelites for a second time? Probably pretty scared, right? They had seen the God of Israel make soldiers fight against fellow soldiers. Maybe that's why they sent Goliath into one-on-one combat. You ever think about that? They thought, okay, we'll take our strongest guy, we'll send him out into one-on-one combat. That way he can't get confused as to who he's supposed to attack. If he's only got one enemy, he's only going to fight that one enemy. Meanwhile, the rest of the Philistine army was a safe distance away. See, often we think the Philistines are these big, bad, scary people. They were the ones that were afraid of the God of Israel. See, our enemy knows the power of God. The Bible says that even the demons believe in God and tremble. James 2:19. But when we lack God confidence, we give the enemy a foothold. Don't give the devil room to stand. Look back on what God has done and have confidence in his faithfulness. Edmund Burke famously wrote, "All it takes for the enemy to win is for good men to do nothing." We can't afford to stand idle when a giant gets in our path. The world needs men who are God confident. We may feel weak in comparison to a giant, but we must remember that God is greater than any Goliath. James Hudson Taylor said this, "All of God's greats have been weak men who did great exploits for God because they relied on his faithfulness." That's stone number 2. What was stone number 2? David's confidence came from God's faithfulness. So stone number 3. David's confidence came from God's calling, his calling on his life. The third source of David's confidence. Now, David was recently anointed the future king of Israel. Do you guys remember that story? The prophet Samuel comes and meets with the shepherd Jesse and goes through all of the sons, right? Starting with Eliab, the oldest, and gets all the way down to David and says, "This is the one. He's the future king of Israel." And he anoints him with oil. So David has received this calling as he's going up to fight Goliath. And he knew that God would fulfill his promises to bring him to that point. He believed that God would remove any obstacles that stood in his way, no matter how tall. And David knew that God was bigger and stronger than the Philistine giant. He knew that God had plans for his life that were greater than dying on the field of battle against just one man. So he went into battle knowing that God would give him victory over Goliath because God had given David his calling. And sure, none of us have been anointed as the future king of Israel, but the Bible tells us that God knows what's in store for us and that he's in control. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord." Jeremiah 29:11. We need to trust God's calling on our lives, whether we've received it yet or not. Trust that God has a plan and a purpose for your life. Then walk in confidence as God begins to direct your path. Trust that he is faithful to make a way for you. But in the story, not everyone approved of David's calling. David's oldest brother, Eliab, saw the confidence of David and he felt weak. He accused his younger brother of abandoning the father's sheep and questioned his motives for arriving at the battle. He doubted the call that God had put on David's life. Yet what is strange about Eliab is that he was there when Samuel anointed David. He was there when God put his calling on his younger brother. Yet Eliab was jealous of his younger brother. As the oldest, he probably felt tossed to the side in light of David's calling. Eliab's jealousy blinded his ability to see what God was doing through his younger brother. Sometimes don't we find ourselves in a similar sort of situation? Maybe we get jealous of somebody else's skills or abilities, or maybe their calling that God has put in their life. And we think, where's my calling? Where's my skills? Why can't I do that? Why isn't God using me? And so out of defense of our own self, we start accusing other people of being in the wrong. We question their integrity and their motives. And we make them seem like they're just attention-seeking. So we're building up a wall to protect ourselves from recognizing our own lack of God confidence. But this isn't right at all. In fact, when we try to diminish what God is doing in another person's life, we could be damaging their own confidence. Not only that, but we are focusing on the wrong person. When we focus on what other people are doing, we're neglecting to pay attention on what God is trying to do in our lives. That's the third stone. Fourth stone. How did David's confidence impact his life? David had confidence in God to defeat all of his foes. I want you younger men to hear this. God can defeat all of your foes. Every obstacle that is before you now and in the future, he can remove those things. When the king, the army, and the older brother were confronted by a giant, they thought, this makes me look weak. But when David heard what came out of Goliath's mouth, he thought, this makes my God look weak. And David is fueled by his God confidence. So he leaves Saul's tent, refusing the armor, and gets ready for battle. But this is where David does something a little strange. And I've always been confused by this. So I'm going to make a suggestion today. I don't know, because the Bible doesn't exactly tell us, and when I get to heaven, I plan on asking David about this. But David does something a little bit weird. Do you remember in the story? He's got, how many giants is he facing that we know about? Just one, right? We only know about the one at this point. But he goes down, and how many stones does he pick up? 5 stones, that's right. I mean, the best thing I could come up with is maybe he thought he would miss 4 times, or maybe he thought it would take more than 1 stone, so he hit him 5 times and that would finish him off. I don't know. But I was reading through this, and I was looking at all of David's life, trying to get the bigger picture. And what's interesting, and this is my suggestion, is that later on we learned that Goliath had 4 cousins. 4 plus 1 is 5. Wow, okay. So he had 4 cousins, and they were almost as big and as strong as Goliath was. Now, we can't know for sure whether they were at the battle that day, but I'm going to suggest that they were. Because imagine David stopping and getting ready for battle, and he stops to pick up his stone to kill Goliath. But just as he reaches down to pick up his stones, he looks and he sees the Philistine army. And behind Goliath, back in the ranks, he sees the men. And as he's looking, he sees, oh, there's a tall guy. Oh, there's another one. Okay, there's a third. 4. 4 plus 1, 5. 5 stones. See, when David appeared to falter in his faith, he is actually trusting God to deliver way beyond his current circumstances. His God confidence was so great that he believed that he wouldn't just slay 1 giant that day, but 5. It's hard enough to have confidence in God to take us out from under our present struggles. But how much harder is it to also trust him with what's coming next? When facing giants, do we believe that God has the ability to not only deliver, but over-deliver? Young men, you have your whole lives ahead of you, with many obstacles that may get in your way, things that you would never see coming. And the lesson that we can learn from David today is to trust God with every situation. Not just the big giants right in front of us, but the ones waiting around the corner too. Our fifth and final stone this morning is that David had confidence in other giant slayers. Toward the end of his life, David got very ill. And knowing this, the Philistines took advantage of his weakened state and they attacked. Gathering his men, David went to meet them in battle, but he grew weary and fell. Seeing David down on the ground, one of Goliath's cousins, one of the four from before, comes to kill the crippled king. David had trained other men to be giant slayers as well. Men who wielded the God confidence necessary to take down Goliath's cousins. And one by one, Goliath's cousins came after David, attempting to take his life. But again and again, David's men stood in their way to defend their teacher and king. 5 giants defeated in battle by Goliath and his giant slayers, or by David and his giant slayers. Right after this moment, after all the giants have been slain, David is reflecting on all that God has done for him. And he writes Psalm 18. I encourage you guys, I'm only going to read a passage, but if you're looking for something to read later, read Psalm 18 and keep in the mindset of what you're hearing today about David and his giant slayer men. Psalm 18 says this, "He rescued me from my strong enemy and from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in my day of calamity, but the Lord was my support." Older men, fathers, staff, counselors, I want to encourage you guys at this point. Are you training up giant slayers? You may have learned to have confidence in God to defeat your foes, but are you teaching others to do the same? Who are you discipling? Before we close things off this morning, I just want to remind you of the 5 stones that we discussed today. Let's see if you guys can remember them with me. The first stone, David is confident in his skill. First stone is skill. Second stone, what is it? He's confident in God's faithfulness. Third stone, David is confident in his calling. Third stone, he's confident to defeat all of his foes. And fifth stone, he's confident in other giant slayers. So skill, God confidence, calling, defeat all the foes, and the fifth one is other giant slayers. When you are facing giants in your own life, are you relying on your own self-confidence or God confidence? David trusted his Lord to deliver him from every enemy, and God was the source of his confidence. Clutching his 5 stones, David was far from being an underdog. He was an expert marksman, confident in a mighty God, the future king of Israel, and a lion killer. And no one, not Goliath or any other giant, could stand in his way. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for giving us your servant David. Help us to seek your heart and to know your faithfulness. You are the supply of the confidence needed to stand up to giants. Embolden us to train up other giant slayers. Form us into your servants, heralds of Jesus Christ and his good news. Amen.